Imagine a steel mountain twice the size of a city block flipped upside down like a dead predator in the freezing fjords of Norway. This wasn't just a shipwreck. It was the beast of the Third Reich, and it's staring back at us through footage most people have never seen. Following the incredible response to our deep dive into the Mutsu salvage today, we're leaving the Pacific Sun behind for the bone-chilling waters of the North Atlantic. We're talking about the Tirpitz, the Bismarck's sister, a 50,000-ton fortress that haunted Winston Churchill's nightmares for years. Even though she spent most of her life as the world's most expensive target, her end was anything but quiet. On November 12, 1944, British tallboy bombs finally broke her back, sending her turtling into the shallow mud of Tromsø. For over a decade, this massive capsized whale of steel stayed there, a grim monument to a fallen empire. But what happened next is where the story gets truly surreal. From 1948 to 1957, salvage crews didn't just move her, they dissected her. Today we're going beyond the history books. We're looking at rare close-up shots of men crawling through her inverted engine rooms and the massive armor plates that were so thick they defy belief. Let's head into the ice and look at the salvage of the Battleship Tirpitz. To truly understand the scale of the Tirpitz, you have to stop looking at her from the cockpit of a Lancaster bomber and start looking at her from the perspective of the men standing in her shadow. When she rolled over in that shallow Norwegian fjord, she didn't just sink. She became a new piece of the coastline, a jagged metallic island rising from the depths. Looking at these first images of the wreck, the sheer verticality of the hull is staggering. It's like looking at a skyscraper that's been tipped on its side and shoved into the mud. Look closely at this shot here. You see those tiny specks near the base of the hull. Those aren't debris or rocks. Those are grown men, German sailors and Norwegian locals standing next to the exposed propeller shafts. In any other context, a ship's propeller shaft is just a piece of machinery. Here it looks like a fallen redwood tree made of solid steel. The men look like ants crawling over the carcass of a leviathan. This is a recurring theme in the Tirpitz salvage. The human scale is constantly being dwarfed by the sheer ambition of 1940s naval engineering. There's a specific photograph that drives this home better than any blueprint ever could. It's a shot of two sailors in a small wooden dinghy rowing alongside the upturned midsection of the ship. The hull rises out of the water like a rusted cliff face. From their perspective, the sky is literally blocked out by the curve of the battleship's belly. The damage to the hull, jagged holes ripped open by the shock waves of the tallboy bombs, is so massive that their entire boat could fit inside a single rupture with room to spare. It's a terrifying reminder that these men were living and fighting inside a machine that was essentially a floating city now turned into a steel tomb. If you compare this to the salvage of the USS Oklahoma at Pearl Harbor, the Tirpitz is a different breed of nightmare. While the Oklahoma was a massive ship, the Bismarck-class battleships were built with a terrifying density. Even the secondary structures, the parts of the ship that weren't even the main attraction, are larger than most civilian vessels of the era. Look at the shots of the men standing near the rudder assembly. The rudder itself is a slab of metal so vast, it seems impossible that a human hand ever designed it. As we move toward the stern in these unseen photos, notice the scaffolding. The salvage crews had to build wooden walkways and platforms just to navigate the slick, algae-covered surface of the hull. These weren't professional deep-sea divers with modern gear. These were men with hand tools and early torches climbing over a structure that felt less like a ship and more like a mountain range. Every step they took was a reminder of the ship's girth. Even the ladders they used, which would look substantial on a construction site, looked like toothpicks leaned against a barn when placed against the Tirpitz's side. This scale isn't just about length or width, it's about thickness. When the salvage work finally began to bite into the ship, the crews realized what they were truly up against. In some of these close-up shots, you can see a man standing next to a cross-section of the armor belt. The steel plate is as thick as the man is tall. Think about that for a second. That isn't just a wall, it's a solid block of Krupp-cemented armor designed to shrug off 1,000-pound shells. Seeing a human being standing next to that raw thickness gives you a visceral sense of the Fortress Norway mentality. The ship was a monster, and even in death, she refused to be easily dismantled. The struggle between the tiny humans and this gargantuan wreck is the heart of the Tirpitz story. Once the initial shock of the Tirpitz's scale wears off, the reality of the salvage task sets in, and it is nothing short of a Herculean labor. From 1948 onward, the joint German-Norwegian salvage team didn't just see a ship. They saw a massive frozen harvest. They began a process that I can only describe as an industrial autopsy. If the wreck was a metal whale, then the workers were the whalers stripping away the blubber of outer plating to get to the valuable heart of the beast. But unlike a natural creature, this beast was made of the toughest steel ever forged, and it was stubborn. In these overhead shots, the process is laid bare. You can see the salvage ships moored alongside the Tirpitz, and the first thing you notice is how pathetic they look. These are sturdy seagoing tugs and cranes, yet they look like toy boats bobbing next to a floating continent. The crew started by cutting into the hull from the bottom up. Remember, she's upside down, so they are literally peeling back the belly of the ship to reach the decks beneath. It's a messy, violent process. This isn't surgical precision. It's brute force engineering. They used oxyacetylene torches to bite through the outer skin, creating gaping, jagged wounds that exposed the internal skeletal structure of the battleship. There is a haunting quality to the photos showing the interior being opened to the Norwegian sky. In one particular image, the camera looks down into a dark, cavernous hole where the hull has been peeled away. Inside, it's a chaotic mess of twisted girders and crushed bulkheads, but there's a strange detail: snow. Because this work dragged on through the brutal Norwegian winters, you can see white blankets of snow settling deep inside the bowels of the ship, resting on machinery that was meant to be buried under layers of armor and deck. It's a chilling juxtaposition, the warmth of a functioning engine room replaced by the literal ice of the North Atlantic. The salvage was a hunt for specific treasures, high-quality steel, copper, and brass. To get to them, the crews had to move in sections. It's exactly like carving a Thanksgiving turkey, but on a scale that defies the imagination. They would section off a piece of the hull, cut it free, and then use massive cranes to wrench it away. You can see in these shots how the ship begins to lose its shape. The sleek, aerodynamic lines of the Bismarck class disappear, replaced by a ruin that looks more like a bombed-out factory than a vessel of war. The unseen part of this footage is the sheer amount of debris. For every ton of valuable scrap they pulled out, there were mountains of useless, twisted metal piping, wiring, and shattered wood that had to be cleared just to reach the next layer of the carcass. As they cut deeper, they hit the armor deck. This was the most grueling part of the dissection. Most scrapping projects are straightforward, but the Tirpitz was built to survive a direct hit from a battleship's main battery. the salvagers found themselves fighting against the very engineering that had made the Tirpitz so feared. In some of these close-up images, you can see the cross-sections of the steel where the torches have finally made their way through. The edges are glowing white or rusted deep red, showing the immense heat required to even mark the armor. The workers are seen standing on these cut edges, looking down into the darkness of the lower decks. It's a vertical world of steel where every floor is a ceiling and every door is a hole in the ground. The sheer industrial grit required for this is staggering. There are no safety harnesses in these photos, no high-tech diving suits. Just men in heavy wool coats and grease-stained caps wielding fire against a titan. They were literally eating the ship from the inside out, turning the terror of the North Seas into piles of scrap that would eventually be melted down to rebuild a broken Europe. As we look at these gaping holes in the hull, we are seeing the final humiliation of the Tirpitz, once a symbol of untouchable power, now being sold by the ton one jagged piece at a time. To step inside the open hull of the Tirpitz during the 1950s was to enter a world where gravity had been murdered. As the salvage crews cut their way deeper into the belly of the beast, they weren't just encountering scrap metal. They were entering a preserved, inverted tomb. The footage and stills from this phase of the operation are some of the most disorienting images in naval history. Because the ship had flipped completely on its back before settling into the silt, everything the salvagers found was upside down. The floor was the ceiling, and the heavy machinery that once hummed deep in the bowels of the ship now hung precariously over their heads, held in place by rusted bolts and sheer luck. In these rare interior shots, you can see the salvagers clambering through the engineering spaces. Imagine the psychological toll of working in these conditions. You are standing on the internal roof of an engine room, looking down at a ceiling that is actually the oily dark floor of the ship. The massive turbines and boilers, once the heartbeat of this 50,000-ton predator, look like prehistoric fossils trapped in a cave of steel. One particular image shows a worker standing next to a control board. He's standing on what should be the overhead, his boots planted on steel plating, while the complex wiring and dials of the ship's electrical heart spill out beneath his feet like mechanical entrails. It is a surreal claustrophobic environment where the cold Norwegian air whistles through the jagged cuts in the hull, creating an eerie moaning sound that many workers claimed sounded like the ship itself was breathing. The unseen footage reveals the chaotic mess of the living quarters as well. Here, the tragedy of the Tirpitz becomes intimate. Among the twisted girders and rusted pipes, the salvage teams found the remnants of daily life, broken porcelain-sodden uniforms, and personal lockers that had been slammed against the ceiling when the ship capsized. There is a haunting shot of a ladder now useless and pointing toward the dark water filling the lower decks, appearing like a skeletal spine in the dim light of the salvage lamps. These spaces weren't just empty rooms. They were pressurized pockets of history. As the workers opened these compartments, they often released trapped air and oil that had been sealed since 1944, a literal breath from the past that smelled of diesel salt and decay. What makes these interior images truly haunting is the detail of the inverted world. You see pipes that once carried steam or fuel winding across the floor in a tangled web. In the dark, wet corners of the hull, the silt of the Norwegian fjord had settled, creating a thick, black sludge that covered everything. In one shot, a man is seen navigating a narrow corridor where the walls seem to be closing in. The scale here is the opposite of the exterior. while the outside was about the massive size of the ship. The inside is about the crushing weight of it. You can feel the thousands of tons of Krupp steel pressing down from above, supported by rotting scaffolding and the ship's own distorted frame. Perhaps the most mysterious part of this ghost inside footage is the sight of the barbettes from the inside. These are the massive circular structures that held the ship's primary and secondary artillery. Because the turrets themselves often fell out or were buried when the ship capsized, the barbettes remained as giant empty silos. Looking up through one of these from the inside is like looking up through the neck of a volcano. They are perfectly circular, incredibly thick, and utterly empty. They serve as a grim reminder that this entire complex maze of pipes and cabins existed for only one purpose: to support the massive guns that once threatened the Allied convoys. As we look at these men working in the flickering shadows of their torches, we realize they were the last people to ever see the Tirpitz as a cohesive structure. They were the ones who saw the private world of the German sailors now turned upside down and drowned in darkness. This wasn't just a salvage job. It was an exploration of a sunken fortress that had been hidden from the world for a decade. The ghosts of the Tirpitz weren't just in the history books, they were there in the engine rooms, in the inverted cabins, and in the silence of the fjord. As the 1950s progressed, the dissection reached its peak, and the Tirpitz underwent a violent industrial resurrection. This was the moment when the ghost in the fjord was finally dragged back into the light of the living, but not as a proud warship. She returned in broken, unrecognizable fragments, a harvest of raw material that would ironically help rebuild the very Europe she had once threatened. In these final stages of the salvage, the footage shifts from the dark claustrophobic interiors to the blindingly cold surface, where massive cranes performed a mechanical miracle, hoisting the heaviest parts of the ship from their watery grave. The most spectacular images from this era involve the turrets and the barbettes. On a Bismarck-class battleship, these are the heavyweights, the components designed to be indestructible. Because the ship was capsized, the salvage crews had to perform a delicate dance with physics to pull these out. Look at this shot of a secondary battery turret being lifted. It hangs from a web of steel cables, water cascading off its armored sides like a waterfall. Even separated from the ship, it looks like a formidable fortress in its own right. There's something deeply surreal about seeing a 15-centimeter gun turret designed to spit fire at destroyers, now dangling helplessly in the air, dripping with mud and seaweed. But the real shock comes when we look at the main battery components. There is a grainy, rare photograph, one of the unseen gems of this collection, that appears to show a massive gun barrel from one of the 38-centimeter main turrets being maneuvered by a floating crane. The barrel is so long and so heavy that it seems to bend the very air around it. It's a moment of peak irony. The great guns of Hitler's Navy, which were meant to dominate the North Atlantic, were now just high-value export scrap. These barrels were sectioned off with specialized cutting gear, turned into manageable logs of steel that would later be melted down in the furnaces of German and Norwegian mills. The resurrection wasn't just about the guns. It was about the skin of the beast. We see piles of armor plate stacked on the shore like giant rusted playing cards. These are the same plates we discussed earlier, the ones as thick as a man. In the salvage yard, they lose their terrifying military context and become industrial assets. This is where the story of the Tirpitz takes a fascinating, almost poetic turn. Unlike many wrecks that are simply left to rot, the Tirpitz was too valuable to vanish. Her steel was low-background steel metal forged before the trinity of atomic bomb tests, making it exceptionally rare and free from radioactive isotopes. While much of her went into mundane things like bridge girders and building foundations, some of this beast's armor ended up in high-precision scientific instruments and even medical equipment. There's a particularly striking shot toward the end of the footage that shows the ghost of the hull, or what's left of it, as a hollowed-out ruin. The once mighty bow of the ship, with its distinctive Atlantic curve, is seen being towed away as a single, mangled piece. It looks like the skull of a prehistoric monster. You can see the anchor pockets and the flared lines that once cut through the Arctic swells, now jagged and blackened by torch fire. The men in the foreground are tiny, dwarfed by this single fragment of the ship's nose. It really puts into perspective that even after 10 years of cutting, the Tirpitz was still putting up a fight. Watching this resurrection, you feel a strange mix of emotions. If you're a fan of naval history, it's a tragedy to see such a pinnacle of engineering reduced to a pile of junk. But there's a sense of justice in it too. The metal that was meant to enforce a dark empire was being reclaimed by the people of Norway. The resurrection as scrap was the final act of the war for this fjord. As the last of the big plates were hauled onto barges, the horizon of Tromsø finally cleared for the first time in over a decade. The beast was gone, but its atoms were starting a new peaceful life. Today, if you visit the quiet waters near Hokoya, the surface of the fjord is calm, betraying nothing of the violence that once shook these mountains. The beast is gone, but the Tirpitz didn't just vanish into the history books. She left a ghost that refuses to be entirely erased. While the salvage crews of the 1950s were incredibly thorough, a battleship of this magnitude doesn't leave without a trace. Scattered across the seabed today are the bones of the giant mangled bits of machinery, discarded cables, and massive chunks of armor plate that were simply too heavy or too buried in the silt to be worth the effort of hauling to the surface. The legacy of the Tirpitz is one of the most unique in military history. It's a legacy of transformation. In Norway, you can still find parts of the ship serving a peaceful purpose. Some of the armor plates were repurposed by the Norwegian Public Roads Administration to be used as temporary road surfaces during construction projects. It's a surreal thought you could be driving your car across the very steel that once shielded Hitler's most feared naval weapon. Even more fascinating is the Tirpitz steel used in high-end knives today. Craftsmen still seek out authenticated fragments of the wreck, forging the ship's soul into blades that serve as a tactile connection to a vanished era. The story of the Tirpitz salvage is a reminder of the sheer scale of human ambition, both in our capacity to build monsters and our relentless drive to dismantle them when they no longer serve us. Seeing these men crawl through the inverted heart of a battleship, torching through 2 feet of solid steel in the freezing dark, gives us a perspective on the post-war era that we rarely see. It was a time of cleaning up the wreckage of the 20th century peace by agonizing peace. If you found this deep dive into the unseen footage of the Tirpitz as fascinating as I did, there is plenty more to explore. We are constantly digging through archives to find these lost chapters of naval history, from the secret salvages of the Pacific to the hidden wrecks of the Atlantic. To make sure you don't miss our next journey into the depths, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It really helps the channel keep these stories alive. The Tirpitz was meant to be an eternal fortress, but in the end, she became a reminder that even the greatest machines are temporary. Only the history remains. What do you think was the most incredible part of the salvage, the inverted engine rooms or the massive armor plates? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.